And I'm a professional development specialist with the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. So this webinar is what we call Spring into Action for FAFSA completion. So we're going to focusing on a lot of efforts to ensure that your students know that they have the support, as well as you as professionals know that you have support to help increase our FAFSA completion rates of the state. So before we begin, can't talk right now. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. And so the session is already being recorded. We'll share it with you on our website, on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions or answers, please ask them. We have a list of panelists who will be joining us today. You can see them listed by their names. And we also, you can see a list of our upcoming webinars on our website, which is listed on here. And we also will be offering PD hours as well as continuing education hours as well. So with that, go ahead and do a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to look at some FAFSA completion data here in the state. We're going to review some updates, have some information with you all when you're working with students and their FAFSA has been filed, sort of what to expect. We'll talk a little bit about verification and professional judgment, especially those students who starting to receive their financial aid offers or their award letters, formerly known as, and then we'll go over some resources for you all. So let's start looking at the data. So this is looking into, and what I forgot to mention earlier is you can zoom in. There's a plus and minus sign where you can zoom in. It's not going to impact everyone else's view. It's just going to be for your view. And so what this chart kind of goes over is the Illinois high school FAFSA completion rates. This is as of the 10th, which was Friday. So looking at here, what we see is that the FAFSA completion rate, which does include alternative application rates as well, this is specifically for Illinois, and we track that data. So we're at 59%, and student who have submitted neither is at 29%. Any student who submitted a non-participation form, had one submitted on their behalf, is roughly 12%. So at 59%, that's a 4% increase from last week. And as well as the non-participation form, it's about 11.5% for those who sort of completed it on their own, and 0.67%. So not even 1% of students. These are for students who've had a waiver submitted on their behalf. So a school who submitted that waiver. I mean, keep in mind, we said this before, those waivers, that is a last attempt, right? Especially coming from the school administrator, which we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So while we're not here to kind of push FAFSA completion, but to really understand sort of where students are in the process, especially if you're working with students who would qualify for the FAFSA, will qualify for some state and financial aid to sort of get them going. And for those who are interested to see what's happening throughout the country, in general, FAFSA completion rates are down across the country, right? And Illinois is not immune to that drop. So a negative 20% percentage points. And right now, what we're looking at, Illinois is currently ranked at third, with LA and Tennessee ranked first and second in that order, respectively, with the national average being 38.1%, just to kind of keep in mind. So we have our financial aid application completion performance metric page up and running. Though it wasn't working for me earlier today, could have just been a browser issue. But what we have on here, and if you click on that hamburger menu on the left corner of financial aid applications, you can review, by region and have other filtering you can use compared to last year to this year to really see that. Now here you see the region, the county, the district information, the high school name, and the school name will also be accompanied with a medal. If the school doesn't qualify for a medal, then they wouldn't see that. And so that's based off of platinum if they completed 95% of FAFSAs or more at platinum 95%, gold is 85% or higher, silver is 75% or higher, and bronze is at 65% or higher. So it'll tell you the number of students, you have the percentage form that's completed, as well as FAFSA completions. Keep in mind here, this gets updated every week, but the information you see in the Gap Access portal that gets updated daily. So you could have, say, if you had a FAFSA completion workshop on a Wednesday, this is not going to get updated on our website until Monday, right? So just expect a few days for that to really reflect on your website. So a little bit about what the data shows. So of course, schools within a district can have different completion rates, especially the larger districts that have multiple high schools on there. And when thinking about this, especially those at the district level, think about like if you notice some schools, you see that big discrepancy between your schools. Well, what sort of resources and support options you can provide for those schools, whether it's partnering with the ISAC core and hosting multiple financial aid application completion workshops, different times, different days, right? But also think about in general, like what can we do to kind of help those students to get those percentage points up, or especially if you notice that the opt-out forms completion rate is higher than what you think they should be, because most of your students, do qualify for financial aid. So talk a little bit about updates. So lots to kind of talk about. A lot of things are kind of coming out from the Department of Education. But keep in mind that for FAFSA submissions, that in mid-April, the FAFSA corrections process became available. So the department began reprocessing 24-25 FAFSAs as well that were impacted by any tax data issues. So you can have an instance which a student was manually entering tax information. They can go back, click consent, and have that direct data exchange manually input that data from the IRS. So that's something they can go back in to do, and that will count as a sort of correction. Records of those were sent to those colleges, those ISERs, right? The institutional student information records. So those were sent to the colleges starting in May 1st. And what colleges do with that information is they start, packaging a financial offer to that student. And then Department of Education mentioned earlier in the week. I mean, it's only Tuesday, but they just mentioned that they're going to begin processing paper FAFSAs by the end of June. So if you are a student that submitted one back in January, February, you want to go back in and make sure you submit an electronic FAFSA. So 99% of 99.9% of FAFSAs are processed on the web, so online. And so that's the preferred method, the method that we recommend. But there were some students who wanted to submit a FAFSA, so they went with the paper version. And keep in mind that even if you go in and submit an online one, it overrides the paper version. And so you still need to create an FSA ID and all that stuff to submit an online form. So there were some updates for contributors without social security numbers. So we know starting with this FAFSA cycle, for a parent didn't have an SSN, they weren't able to create an FSA ID, so they had to go in and manually sign that FAFSA, right? So that process no longer exists. So now everyone is required to have an FSA ID. Every contributor is required to have an FSA ID, but there were some parents who were stuck in the process. They couldn't create one. They couldn't get through the TransUnion questions, or maybe they were able to complete the TransUnion questions, but still had to complete the attestation form to verify their identity. So we're seeing that right now. Most of it has been solved for parents who don't have an SSN. They can temporarily go in and create an FSA ID without having to go through the through any hurdles. So they're able to access an FSA ID. However, if they can't answer the TransUnion questions, or they don't see the TransUnion questions, they will have to go back in and verify their identity at a later date. So the Department of Education is keeping record of this information, and will be reaching out to parents soon about that information. So if you are working with the family and you're helping them create an FSA ID and they don't go through the attestation questions, just know that down the road they're going to be required to verify their identity. Or even parents right now who are stuck in the process, haven't heard from the Department of Education about their attestation form, should go in and use their FSA ID. So some big takeaways on here. So contributors without SSNs will not have to wait until their identity to be validated. If the manual process is required to verify their identity, that process is still going to be required. They're just going to be able to use their FSA ID. So all of this kind of translates into processing delays. In fact, the Department of Education, in relation to their Office of Federal Student Aid, they have a website dedicated to tracking all of the reported issues with the FAFSA, and there's so many in which they're categorized. And so just know that, this is not an issue of your student or your parents, that this is an ongoing issue that's plagued the entire 24-25 application cycle for the FAFSA. So just know that if there's a processing delay with FAFSAs, the impact that it has on ICERs, the impacts that it has on students going in and making corrections, the impact that it has with financial aid offers and the timing and delay of them, as well as students who need to make an appeal or seeking professional judgment and making a change to their financial aid offer. And of course, at the end of the day, deciding where that student wants to go. So here in Illinois, we've seen many of the schools either use like a rolling admission style or push their date from May 1st, to decision date from May 1st to June 1st. And plus, institutions are well aware of what's been happening. And so anything that a student has issues, they should just reach out to the financial aid office at the school and let them know what's going on so they can all be on the same page. So with the FAFSA graduation requirements, so this is not going away this year. In fact, this is in partnership with ISB. And so Illinois public high school students are still required to complete a FAFSA or non-participation opt-out form. So while we understand that the challenges this year has made it extra difficult for students and families to complete this process, so ISAC is here and available to provide any resources, any workshops that you think they may benefit from your students. And we've always mentioned this before. This process is not meant to be a barrier for students from graduating. So if you are working with students and you know that they didn't complete the FAFSA, you can go into Gap Access and check using the temporary flexibilities that are now in place. You can go in and just check a box simply stating that you didn't complete a FAFSA. You tried reaching out to them, you just click that waiver box and that's good. It's not going to keep the student from graduating. And so that admin waiver is granted to students by any person in the school with access to their Gap Access portal as an administrator. They can go in and just simply check that box, and it's going to mark them in their Gap Access. So when they print out their rosters, it'll include that information. So anyone that has an admin account that is an authorized user can grant that waiver. So after a student goes into the FAFSA, we'll talk about sort of what happens next, right? So the student will receive a FAFSA submission summary, formerly student aid report, SAR. So it's now the FAFSA submission summary. What this does is it basically documents the information they report on their FAFSA. And it'll also determine their eligibility for federal student aid. So it'll also include the student's student aid index, SAI, which is replacing EFC, the expected family contribution. So the students are going to receive that in email, or if there is an issue with their processing, they couldn't send it via email, they will receive it via mail. But keep in mind, anytime that happens with mail, it does take additional time to process, but it's going to come via email. So to find that information, and what we've also seen is students receiving just flat out wrong communication from the Department of Education. In terms of they submitted the 24-25, they will get an email saying they've made corrections or corrections are ready, or their 23-24 FAFSA has been filed, even though they know they filed the 24-25. So there's just a barrage of glitches happening in terms of the notification process. So if you see that and notice that, definitely let us know. That way, because we have a far reach, that way we let our ISAC core members know, and that way they can go out and let other folks in other regions know, so that we're all on the same page. But we saw that it was reported out, and so the best bet for students to know exactly what they need to do is by logging in and checking their activity to see their status of their FAFSA submission. So they can see whether it's been processed, whether it still needs corrections. So in this specific example, it's telling the student that their FAFSA submission summary is ready. And so that information will display what their eligibility is, their answers, their responses to the FAFSA questions, and any next steps, especially if they've been selected for verification. So you see this is categorized by tabs, and they can always go in and see exactly what's going on. So a little bit about student aid index information. So on the eligibility overview, students are going to see what their SAI is. And so I tell students all the time. So check in, see what it says, have your FAFSA submission summary page open, to see if there's anything that you don't remember being on there. Or especially if you're working with a student and you notice their SAI is high and you're like, I don't think this is correct, or they don't have an SAI, you can go back in to see how they responded to some of those questions. But again, it will tell you the range of a student index. It can be as low as negative 1500, and the sky is the limit here, right? But for a student, this is one of the bigger changes this year. Back in the EFC days, the lowest it would be was a 0. So now we can see a negative SAI information. So those is what's essentially telling the institution that we have a more sort of needy student. So the next step, so under that tab, a student will see if they need to make any corrections, what steps they need to do to make those corrections, and figuring out the school if they have everything that they need. So the best bet is to reach out to the institution. Schools, when requesting information from students, may request very similar information or not so similar information. So it's going to be based off that institution, especially if the student's been selected for verification or the student is seeking professional judgment. They could still be shopping around for a financial aid package that better suits their needs. And so they're just waiting to hear back from certain institutions. And so it's one of those things where students are just kind of are waiting and seeing. But a student can always select the drop-down arrow to view all that information. So when it comes to the FAFSA status tracker, so here the students can see exactly what their status of their FAFSA is. So going by my activity, they will see what their FAFSA is in the process. So here in this example, the student started their FAFSA on January 2nd, and the FAFSA was processed on March 15th. And from there, indicating that their FAFSA has been processed. Again, there is a difference between submitted and processed. So submitted is just the date Department of Education received your FAFSA. Processed means they went through it and calculated an SAI if applicable, or they're processed the FAFSA. So these are the statuses for this year. So the FAFSA that's in draft. So if the student's in their My Activity and you see their status of their FAFSA, it's going to be one of these statuses. If it's in draft mode, their section of the FAFSA form is incomplete. In progress, you've provided your consent, approval, and signature to their section of the FAFSA form, but has not been submitted yet. If it's in review, their FAFSA form was submitted but hasn't been processed yet. If there's any action required, it will tell them, like in this example, they're missing their consent and approval or a signature, but their FAFSA was processed, but a correction is required. It's something that's processed, meaning that the application was processed successfully and no further action is required. So this means that their FAFSA is fully processed, right? Nothing else is needed from them. And when something is closed, it means their FAFSA form was never submitted and they can no longer be submitted because the federal deadline has passed. So students essentially have until July 1st of 2025 to submit a 2024-2025 FAFSA. And then with FAFSA corrections, so students can go in to studentaid.gov using their FSA ID. And if they're making any changes to the parent section or the parent needs to make changes, the parent signature is also required. So students can receive a FAFSA submission, submit a summary by mail. And if they do so, they can make that change via mail and mail it out to the Department of Education with the address that's listed. I really wanted to say email address. With the address that's listed on there. Keep in mind, students can make corrections online regardless of how their FAFSA form was processed. So if a student doesn't resubmit a FAFSA online, they submitted a paper version, and if they wanted to make corrections online, they'll have to create an FSA ID. And so they have all that information and they can see their FAFSA submission summary online. They need an FSA ID first. And then they can make corrections online. they can go to the institution, whatever's more convenient for that student. So let's talk a little bit about verification and professional judgment. So the 24-25 verification cycle, Department of Education mentioned that there will be no significant changes to what they consider as acceptable documentation. By 24-25 FAFSA, they did mention, Ed has mentioned that they are going to significantly reduce verification this year, with the exception of students who are verified for identity. They need to definitely go through that process. So contributors who have their tax information reported from the IRS, they're not going to be required to have their information verified by schools because that's coming directly from the IRS. Those are those who provide consent for the IRS to use a direct data exchange and provide that information onto the FAFSA. And for those who manually enter their tax information, you should work with them to either be ready to submit a copy of their tax return, a signed copy of their tax return, or request a tax return transcript to submit that to the school. So I have some examples of acceptable documentation. So remember, with verification, it is just there to ensure that the information reported in the FAFSA is accurate. It's not there to kind of single out students. But keep in mind, those who are typically selected for verification are your needy students. So it's something that you just want to pay closer attention to and explain that to students when they select for verification. It's not something they did wrong. It's more of a process from the Department of Education to ensure that information reported on the FAFSA is accurate. So when it comes to reporting family size, students can submit a signed statement that includes the name, age, and relationship to the student for each member of the household. And then for someone verified for identity statement of educational purpose, they can submit a signed statement certifying that the federal student aid received will only be used for educational purposes only. And so they mentioned a couple slides ago about what's something students can submit for as acceptable documentation. So the Department of Education puts out like some language and documents that students can use. If the FAFSA is verifying the identity statement of educational purpose, they have to use that exact form. It has to be notarized. They have to bring in an unexpired ID with them to verify their identity. It's part of the signature process. So for some examples of acceptable documentation for income earned includes a tax return transcript or a tax account transcript. If you're working with a student whose parents or themselves have amended a return, so they should request a tax account transcript because it shows both the regular and the updated information. Or they can submit a signed copy of their tax return. Now, students requesting tax return transcripts, those are free, right? So if a parent were to request a tax return or a copy of their tax return, then it's essentially they're paying for it. It costs $50 to do that. So a tax return transcript is fine, but if they want to make a copy of their own return and submit that and sign it, that's fine as well. And then for non-tax filers, so new to this year, if someone didn't file taxes, the direct data exchange will indicate that there is no tax return on file for the individual for that year. In the past, they've had to submit a verification of non-filing, which they have to prove that the IRS doesn't have a return on file. And keep in mind that doesn't indicate whether they're required to or not. So schools can verify the student and say, like, well, what sort of income do you have? To show proof that the income reported on the FAFSA is indeed accurate. Because keep in mind, all this information is coming from the IRS. So if they haven't filed taxes, they have nothing to report from the IRS, but they still need to provide consent. They just have to manually enter tax information, if applicable, right? Or income information, I should say. So a little bit about professional judgment. So there are essentially two new categories of professional judgment. And keep in mind, professional judgment is the use of authority for school financial aid administrators to make changes that either are due to special circumstances or unusual circumstances. So institutions can't make changes to the federal formula, but they can make changes for any data elements or within the cost of attendance or information reported in the FAFSA that could impact the student aid index calculation. That would be a special circumstance. And an unusual circumstance is making adjustments to the student's dependency status based off of a unique situation. So schools can no longer maintain a policy of denying all professional judgment requests. So that's new for this year. And schools are also required to have an adequate list of documentation that can be used for making that request as well. Now, for financial aid administrators, they can still deny a professional judgment request. They just if they've never done them before, they just have to have a policy in place. But they can't have a policy stating that they don't do professional judgment. So what's the main difference between the two? Think about unusual circumstances. In this specific example, like students who are victim of human trafficking, students who receive are granted refugee or asylum status. Again, this is granted, right? You could be working with students who have applied for it. They're in the process, but they haven't received it yet, or it hasn't been approved, and then they are not eligible yet for federal financial aid. Parent abandonment or estrangement, or student is incarcerated, or their parents are incarcerated. So some special circumstances, maybe you have loss of employment or financial assets, or you may have, like a savings account set up, but there's medical expenses happening that's not covered by insurance, which will significantly draw down the funds from that account, would be an example of a special circumstance. So think about special circumstances impacting SAI eligibility because of the numbers involved within that, or cost of attendance changes, and unusual circumstances are usually known as dependency override. So a student who cannot answer yes to any of the dependency questions are essentially a dependent student. And if they can't, then they have to provide information on their parents. But what's new is you could have students who aren't able to answer yes to those questions, but still can provide information on their parents because they can be considered a provisionally independent student. And so they can go onto the FAFSA without providing information. Keep in mind, institutions, they make the final say. And of course, they can make determinations based off determination made at another institution. Just have to document that. But these are students who believe they will qualify as independent based off the student's unusual circumstance. They could have something that stops them from saying yes to any of those questions because they don't have, say, like an unaccompanied or homeless youth determination letter, but they're fleeing their parents who were abusive, right? And the parents could still essentially provide a place to live for that student, but the student was being abused. And so they ran away from home, and that could qualify the student as a provisionally independent student. So they still have to go through professional judgment. This just allows the student to see their SAI estimate. And so they will see a provisional SAI, they go through the professional judgment process, and then a provisional status will get removed and will stay to their regular SAI. So some determinations for unaccompanied or homeless youth. So keep in mind, for FAFSA purposes, students have to meet both that definition. So unaccompanied, meaning you're not in the custody of your parent or guardian, and homeless, meaning you're either couch surfing, living in hotels, motels, or you don't have a physical space you call home in which you live in. And some students might not even consider themselves as homeless. They could be living with a family friend. But keep in mind that only your parents are legally required, or guardians are legally required to you know, provide that for you. So the student again may not consider themselves. So for FAFSA purposes, a student to be eligible needs to meet both of those definitions, and they have to have a source from a homeless district liaison, a financial aid office from a school from the same or prior award year, students who are receive services from a transitional emergency shelter, a street outreach program, a homeless youth or drop-in center, or programs serving individuals experiencing homelessness, as well as what's new, programs supported by federal TRIO or Gear Up grants. And then some changes for colleges. And keep in mind, students who go through this process are presumed to be independent for the remaining year, so they don't have to go through that process every time. And so some changes for colleges. So institutions can accept documentations of independent students at different institutions, as mentioned. And so a big key here is that institutions for students who are seeking professional judgment, they have to highlight on their website the different processes that are in place for them, what are acceptable forms of documentation, some examples of it. But I think what's a very welcoming change is that students who go through this process are considered independent through their unusual circumstance, they're going to be deemed independent, right, for financial aid purposes, for the subsequent award years. And we've seen some institutions do that already, but it's great that the Department of Education provides this and allows the schools to have more flexibility for this. So I have some recommendations for you all. So definitely encourage your students to gather as much information as possible. Going through the verification and professional judgment process can be rather intimidated. So just want to encourage students to, be positive, keep copies of everything, be able to submit those supporting documentation, not because the institutions themselves think that the student is lying, but as a process the Department of Education requires of institutions to do because they do audit institutions. And they just want to make sure that the schools are following their processes in place, that they're just not listening to whatever the student says and providing that for them, right? It has to have some kind of documentation in place. So if you need anything, ask questions, right? I tell students all the time when I'm working with them, hey, I have to ask them personal questions because if I don't know the answers to them, I just won't be able to fully help you, right? Or I can't help you to the full extent, right? So that pretty much does it for the content of this presentation. We do have some resources that I wanted to kind of go over with you all to help you with FAFSA completion, right? We want to see those numbers increase at your schools because those will translate to increased percentage for the state. But most importantly, we want to make sure that the students who want to go to college, know that they have access to free money to go to college, right? So we talked a little bit about this in the beginning, right? But for high schools, you have the Financial Aid Application Completion Initiative. And so all of ISAC's resources are available at no cost, right? So don't expect to, have to pay for anything. And I think that always helps. So high schools can track FAFSA, alternative application, and opt-out waiver completions at your school. So this is something that ISAC updates every day, but again, it's not going to be updated in the performance page where we show all of the school's completion statuses. So you won't see your percentage unless you're manually keeping track of that yourself, and then you can compare that. Here you can also make any roster adjustments. For public high schools, we use rosters provided by ISB, so you can't go in and manually add information. But what you can do is you can remove and add students. So especially in some school districts may have more turnover, attrition rates. So just kind of thinking about that. But at the end of the year, by July 31st, you can print out your roster for the FAFSA graduation compliance. And keep in mind, you can see a lot of information on here. The neat thing is you see the select status is for students who trying to get the control bar to work for me. But the select status is useful for when you're selecting individual students to delete. So keep in mind if you are having to delete multiple students, just do one at a time so that you can avoid accidentally deleting a student that's still in your school. The opt-out waiver, so that's grayed out because that's on the student. So if they go in and submit a waiver, you'll see that checkbox. And keep in mind, they can always go back in and submit a FAFSA, right? Submitting a waiver doesn't stop them from doing that. And if you know a student that had done that, they completed a waiver, but then go back and submitted a FAFSA, their FAFSA information will be processed and shown on here, and the waiver will be unchecked, right? So if a student submitted a paper waiver, that will be checked on there that you can check. Or what's the new is which here it says good faith effort, but will not, it now says FAFSA simplification admin waiver. So they can go in and check that box. They can see their first name, last name of the student, their date of birth, their FAFSA status, whether it was filed and an SAI was calculated. This is where it's really helpful if you're working with students who are like, wait a minute, I know this student should have received an SAI. Let me go back to see how they answered some questions with the FAFSA. And it turns out they said that they were in graduate school or will be in graduate school, right? That's often a common mistake. So as I mentioned about the FAFSA waiver, and this is new for this year, especially with all the issues plaguing the FAFSA. We added that FAFSA, the admin waiver, the FAFSA simplification waiver. So if there's any instance in which you're going through this and students have already graduated, right, you don't have a hold of them anymore, you can just go in and check that box, the admin waiver, and that's it. There's nothing else you need to do. So in the past, you've had to write like a good faith effort, like what were some things that you've done to reach out to that student and their parents, and what happened, why couldn't you get a hold of them? All I have to do is just check that box right now. So really, and this is a last attempt, right? Because the FAFSA graduation requirement isn't there to stop students from graduating. It's there to provide information for the students to be aware that if they decide to go to college, they could be eligible for some free money, right? And know that, hey, this is how much money they could be potentially leaving out on the table. And what we really like and push for in the financial aid application completion initiative is that you use this tool as you see fit, and you can use it to provide more of a targeted approach to working with your students, because then you know, like, hey, I have 12 students that haven't submitted their FAFSA. I can now just focus my efforts on them instead of having to keep track manually, right? It's all on here. And so with some admin waiver details, kind of talked about this already, but for folks who joined late. So you can go in and select multiple students at a time and check those waivers. And so the reasons for granting that admin waiver has been temporarily removed. So you can just simply, it's just checking that box, right? You don't have to document that information this year, right? And anyone who has an admin account on Gap Access can grant that waiver. So for students who you've granted a waiver for, we've asked to please share this information with your students. And I'm just going to go ahead and read this message. An administrative waiver for the high school graduation requirements has been granted and submitted on your behalf. If you are a high school senior and did not complete a FAFSA or alternative application, please provide your contact information by completing the brief form at isac.org/connect. You will receive additional information from the Illinois Student Assistance Commission, ISAC. And so what we will be doing is ensuring that those students who've had that waiver form submitted on their behalf, we'll be reaching out to them, finding a way to reach out to them. This is the best way to do it because they're manually signing up, providing their information. We'll have their information. We can follow up with them, provide one-on-one assistance, and ensuring that if they know what the FAFSA and alternative applications are, and if they still want to submit it, they can still do so. And you can also, this is what it looks like. Tells them a little bit about getting access to financial assistance. They just provide their name, first name, last name, and their mobile number. And they'll see the terms and conditions on there. So we don't spam. We don't collect any information that we don't already know. And so in this specific example, right, we're just reaching out to the student, letting them know if they still need help submitting their FAFSA, if there's any workshops happening in the area, or if they need to connect with anyone. Here are some people that they can connect to, right? I tell folks all the time, right? We're a state agency, right? We're not here to collect information just to collect information, right? And as sort of mentioning our ISI course, so they're available year round, right? Not just during the financial aid season, although it seems this year the financial aid season is never ending. So our ISI core are there to provide, one-on-one assistance to help students and navigate the college and financial aid application process, especially during this year. There's a big potential for summer melt for students who have every intention to go to college, but stop because they get bogged by verification melt. They forgot to make a deposit. So our core members are there. They're working over the summer, right? We'll be in Benedictine or wherever we are in the summer, wherever we house our summer trainings. But we do a 4 to 6 week summer training in person where we provide all sort of assistance to ISAC core members. You can go out and be a helpful resources to members in their community, right? But they partner with high school districts, high schools themselves, community-based organizations to do outreach, right? To ensure that students are submitting their FAFSA applications, submitting their college applications, understanding what's in their financial aid offer, understanding what additional steps they need to make in order to make a successful transition from high school to college. I was saying that more for an encouragement for schools who really just utilize core members for financial aid applications, right? They can do much more than that. So with our ISAC Q&A feature, students can get answers to any questions they have on the College of Financial Aid process. So they can sign up for text messages. Again, this is not spam. So students to get started, they text their first and last name to, we have two numbers for English speakers or for Spanish speakers. So as I said on here, so for English, it's 847-243-6470. And for Spanish speakers, it is 773-823-0570. And then a little bit about, of course, about our ISAC student portal. So on there, we list all the resources that we have available at no cost for students, whether it's college and scholarship searches, financial aid games, claim your future, money management tips, or if they want to see some short videos about applying to college, understanding my financial aid offer, all that information is on here. So we also have information on our First Generation Scholars Network. So to join the network, it is free. And these are for students who are first in their family to go to college. So they can connect with the first generation mentor. They can get assistance in helping a first generation preparation program and the college campus they're interested in enrolling to. And can also check in to see what sort of events are happening across the state. And we also have our FAFSA communication toolkit. So if you need any assistance in terms of putting together some flyers, banners, emails, robocalls, scripts, social media posts, you name it, we have tons of different examples on there that you can use at no cost to reach out to your students to ensure that you're getting that information and the message out. And mentioned a little bit about open issues for the FAFSA earlier in the webinar, but Federal Student Aid has been tracking and categorizing them. So these are the categories: FAFSA form, FAFSA submission summary, corrections, or resolved issues. So you can see a list of open issues, whether they've been resolved, if there are any workarounds to it. And as I've been telling my colleagues, there's so much to kind of keep track of. So it's helpful to have that information so you can always go in and quickly make any changes to any information that you need. As well as our division in college access and outreach, our professional development team, myself and my colleagues included, we provide free trainings for college access professionals. So we have a list of topics that include going over the FAFSA line by line, going over some of the changes to the FAFSA itself, the FAFSA simplification, or the monthly webinars that we host. Right, so we're here to provide a resource. We have an outreach request form, they request that you can put in. If you need anything kind of special, you can write in, and we'll do our best to accommodate your request. As mentioned, so we're here to help, right? So I have my email on here as well. I have our ISAC.outreach training at illinois.gov as well. And so that is our training inbox email where if you would love to receive the quickest response, I respond pretty quickly. But when you have 6 people managing a training inbox, you can have more people looking them over. But with our ISAC connection, so that is new, where we have our own texting number where you can go in, ask a question, and get a real response by a real person. So you can text that number 847-250-2384. Again, this one's mainly for college access professionals, where you can go in and ask your question. So you have more information on our latest trainings on our website at isac.org/PD. And then if you would like to sign up for e-messaging, which I highly recommend, and that will be dependent upon your role, we will tailor messaging and opportunities for you and any of our partners. You just go to isac.org/e-messaging, and you can opt out anytime. So for those who are requesting CE and PD hours, we ask that you please submit and my colleague Megan has already posted the evaluation on our chat, or you can scan the QR code here. But if you are requesting CE or PD hours, you complete the evaluation. If you're requesting PD hours specifically, we would need you to include your EIN. Now, if you're not requesting PD hours, you can just skip through all that portion and just just continue on and check that you're requesting CE hours. You do have until Thursday, May 16th at 4:30 p.m. to submit that. Again, that link is on there. It's in the chat. Chat was closed for some time, but if you hover over panel options and see that chat bubble, you can go ahead and request that. And I'm sharing this again for those who want to reach out to us, who have any questions, they can reach out to us, as well as our e-messaging platform as well. So you can stay up to date what's happening at ISAC. We share any press releases, any updates to resources, really anything that's beneficial for that specific group. So thank you all for attending this webinar in Spring to Action FAFSA completion. I especially appreciate you guys joining during lunch. We'll keep this open for a few minutes in case folks have any questions that still need answered. But thank you all and have a great rest of your day.